Beautiful Anonymous changes each week. It defies genres and expectations. For example, our most recent episode, I talked to a woman who survived a murder attempt by her own son. But just the week before that, we just talked the whole time about Star Trek. We've had other recent episodes about sexting in languages that are not your first language, or what it's like to get weight loss surgery. It's unpredictable, it's real, it's honest, it's raw. Get Beautiful Anonymous wherever you listen to podcasts.
Hey everyone, Laszlo Montgomery here with another China History Podcast episode. This one's special for Jerry in Danville. 9 years ago, he suggested this topic to me, and I promised Jerry I'd get to it one day. And when I began work on this one, the U.S. and China were locked in this cage match of a trade war. And at all my China yak shows that I prescribed to, and in so many discussions with my friends in Asia, well, the word on the street is that there's never been anything like this before. How did we get here? In many of these past CHP episodes, we've looked at all kinds of Chinese-American history and topics concerning the history of U.S.-China relations. Because of recent events, I was inspired to present that episode on William McKinley, his 1890 tariffs, and the open door policy. And this time, I'd like to further wind the clock back to the 1860s and focus on Anson Burlingame and all the history that he was right in the middle of. Californians all heard of Anson Burlingame before. There's a city located just south of San Francisco Airport named for the subject of today's episode. Maybe there's a chance Anson Burlingame's name came up in social studies class for anyone who went through the American education system. So I thought, let's look at Burlingame and what he tried to do back in the late 1860s. Amidst this historical rancor that's going on all around us, I thought maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea to look back on those post-Opium War years and all the hopes that so many back then had. It reminds me of today. Of course, well, it's a much different set of historical circumstances, but just the same, back then and today, there were wildly different opinions about how to engage the Empire of China. So let's look at Burlingame's life and times. He was born in rural central New York in 1820. James Monroe had just been elected to his second term as our fourth president. Slavery was as volatile an issue then as it had ever been. And Anson Burlingame was one of the most vocal, eloquent, and fiery abolitionists of his day. He was one of the loudest anti-slavery voices, both at the state and federal level. And before he entered government, he practiced law in Boston and was elected to the Massachusetts State Senate in 1852. And 2 years later, in 1854, he began serving his first of two terms as a U.S. congressman in Washington, D.C., part of the new Republican Party. In every biography or write-up about Anson Burlingame, what's always mentioned, besides his anti-slavery stance, was his greatness as a public speaker. He had that rare talent of eloquence, even when he was speaking extemporaneously. His ability to stand up and knock it out of the park with his speeches was one of Anson Burlingame's defining characteristics. During the 1860 presidential election, Burlingame was a very strong supporter of Abraham Lincoln, who was running against Stephen A. Douglas and John C. Breckinridge. And after winning, when it came time to pass out the prizes, Lincoln made Burlingame the U.S. minister to the Austrian Empire. The Austrians gave Honest Abe the thumbs down on his selection of Burlingame. They did not care for his outspokenness regarding Hungarian independence and his support for Lajos Kossuth during his U.S. visit in 1851-52. Lincoln knew a cabinet pick was out of the question. Burlingame was too divisive a figure, and with the whole matter of slavery about to come to a climax, the new president thought about it and decided on June 14th, 1861, to stick him in China as the U.S. minister there. The second one in American history, the first being Caleb Cushing, signer of the 1844 Wangxia Treaty. In 1860, Burlingame, and knew as much about China as the next guy, so prior to his arrival in Beijing to take up his new post, he schooled himself on the general situation there, and he became wise to the court politics and the sensitivity surrounding the matter of carrying out social and political reforms. He did his homework and spent his first months on the ground learning everything he could that might help him in his diplomatic task. Burlingame, with family in tow, made his way to Macau first, arriving in October 1861. The Xianfeng Emperor had just died 2 months prior, and he was succeeded by his 6-year-old son, the Tongzhi Emperor. The Xinyu Palace coup, led by Empress Dowager Cixi and Princes Gong and Chun, was just about to take place. Cixi and her faction, after successfully seizing power, would remain firmly in charge of the Qing government, and things would stay that way for the next half-century. Burlingame arrived in China during this post-Treaty of Tianjin era that saw China at one of its historic low points. He recognized what was going on and the geopolitical dynamic that had caused this, and he developed a passion, I guess you could call it, to reverse course on this policy of coercion that had already led to a number of unequal treaties and enmity that would last into our day. China found itself trapped in a situation where they, the ancient and by many metrics the superior civilization, were being browbeaten by other nations who only had in their favor better weapons of war. Not long after arriving in China and spending some time getting the lay of the land and speaking with some of the perhaps 4 or 5 dozen Westerners residing in Beijing at that time, he wrote to Secretary of State William Seward, saying, quote, "If the treaty powers could agree among themselves to the neutrality of China, and together secure order in the treaty ports, and give their moral support to that party in China in favor of order, the interest of humanity would be subserved." End quote. Burlingame, from the get-go, pushed his agenda of cooperative relations over coercive relations. Burlingame wanted to be of assistance to China at this rather dark hour for not only the dynasty, but, well, for China in general. When he wrote those words to Seward in 1862, the Taiping Rebellion had been going on for 12 years and still had 2 more to go. The Nian Rebellion was still devastating Anhui and the provinces surrounding Anhui. He saw what was going on. He knew a defeated and distracted China was easier to extract unequal treaties, and Burlingame was part of that group of diplomats and businessmen who believed, well, most of them for selfish reasons, the Manchus needed to be propped up rather than be allowed to die the natural death that seemed imminent. If the dynasty up and died, what would replace it? In the face of all the rebellion and national hopelessness, Burlingame joined with those inside and outside the Qing court who were dedicated to reforming and modernizing China and showing by example why it was in China's benefit to join the family of 19th century trading nations. Burlingame arrived in Beijing July 20th, 1862. With his affability and pleasant character, it took no time at all to fall in with all the important foreigners now privileged to reside in Beijing thanks to the terms in the Treaty of Tianjin, later ratified in the Convention of Beijing, and it didn't take long for Burlingame to establish himself as a kind of unofficial dean of the foreign diplomats. He comprised 1/4 of a group of men known as the 4 Bs. These 4 were the first Western envoys to reside in the capital. Besides Anson Burlingame, there were Sir Frederick Bruce of Great Britain, Jules Berthamy of France, and Louis Balasek of Russia. For various reasons, these 4 men in particular were held in high esteem by the reform-minded Manchus at the imperial court. Following the conclusion of the Second Opium War and subsequent treaties, these 4 Bs were looked to by the reformers at the imperial court as people who might be willing to advocate on their behalf and advise them in their initial attempts at reform. The four Bs represented the early voices among the Westerners who called for keeping out of China's internal affairs. They also saw nothing wrong in standing up for China in this post-Opium Wars period when China was unable to defend itself or push back on foreign demands that made a mockery of their sovereignty. The four Bs, Burlingame, Bruce, Balasek, and Berthemy, starting in June 1863, began meeting regularly to discuss the matter of trying an alternative tack with China, one that paid heed to the country's territorial integrity, that called for conciliation over coercion, and that would help guide China to enter this new modern age. Burlingame was particularly close with Sir Frederick Bruce. Those two were constantly in each other's company and saw eye to eye on this notion that the treaty powers of the day were all much better served having a stable and functioning China. And from these regular meetings and discussions, the four Bs had come to believe that the Treaty of Tianjin needed a little work done on it. And Prince Gong was beginning to get the feeling that Anson Burlingame might be someone who could possibly be their champion in presenting China's case to the Western powers. It was no ordinary time for Burlingame and his country. Around the same time he arrived in Beijing, the American war between the states was in full swing. General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army was taking the fight to the Union. The Second Battle of Bull Run would soon be underway in Manassas, Virginia. The way things were looking at that time, in 1862, the country and the government Burlingame was representing here in China soon might not even exist. So, while he was there, Anson Burlingame had this uncertainty hanging over his head. No small number of traders and missionaries felt, with China down on its luck, on its knees, now was the time to gorge oneself and make their China dreams happen no matter the consequences or long-lasting hard feelings. From the spring of 1865 to autumn 1866, Burlingame was back in the USA. By then, the Civil War was over and Reconstruction was starting to get underway. The matter of China and coming up with a new policy to engage them on new and equal footing was not a priority. Nonetheless, Burlingame used his time effectively to meet with government officials as well as captains of industry, where he used his God-given skills as an orator to present China in a positive light. And almost a year after his return to China to finish his term as chief minister, on November 21st, 1867, Burlingame resigned his post. He planned to return to the U.S. and resume his political career. Chances were good that he'd be able to parlay his years in China into something. But at a farewell event in his honor, Prince Gong, as head of the Zhongli Yamen, reached out to Burlingame and offered him the official diplomatic post of High Minister Plenipotentiary and Envoy Extraordinaire to represent the Qing imperial court to the Western powers. Well, it wasn't so simple as that. Before approaching Burlingame, Prince Gong did have to get the emperor's approval, who was still only a fifth grader. A memorial had been sent up the chain of command, and the regency led by Cixi signed off on the notion of enlisting the services of Anson Burlingame to advocate on their behalf before the treaty powers to essentially take some of the unequalness out of those treaties they had been forced to sign. To send one of their own would have been preferable, but as Prince Gong knew, at that time, among the Manchu court in 1867, there wasn't a soul who had the language skills and sophistication to take on a matter this grave. They needed to enlist a ringer for their side. And here begins that part of Anson Burlingame's life that he's best remembered for. Prince Gong and fellow Qing Grand Council member Wen Xiang wanted Burlingame to deliver this message to the treaty powers that China sought friendly relations and wished to open up more to trade and investment. Both Prince Gong and Wen Xiang led the charge on the Manchu side during the self-strengthening Ziqiang movement that lasted from 1861 to 1895. It had been both of those men who, right after the Convention of Beijing, had set up the Zhongli Yamen. They saw the old ways of dealing with the foreigners was over. This office was set up to handle the new realities. So Burlingame resigned his post as minister and started wearing a different hat at once. He went to Tianjin first and then on to Shanghai, where he awaited the arrival of the other members of this mission he was going to lead to the capitals of the treaty powers. He made the most of his time there, meeting with many important and influential persons of the day, and he found time to sail to Nanjing to meet personally with Zheng Guofan. Unlike his protege Li Hongzhang, Zheng was not a terribly outward-looking leader and was rather unconcerned with the particulars of this mission Burlingame was undertaking on behalf of the emperor. Burlingame had already written to Secretary of State Seward saying, quote, "You will have learned from your telegram from Beijing of my appointment by the Chinese government as an envoy to the treaty powers and my acceptance of the same." End quote. This was a rather extraordinary act, serving as an envoy for a foreign power, and the Chinese Empire at that. Burlingame stressed out about how this would be received in the U.S. No one gave him any major grief, at least not in the public prints. In Europe, however, there was plenty of bellyaching about him. By all accounts, this was a very extraordinary assignment he was taking on. The four Bs, Burlingame, Bruce, Berthemy, and Balasek, after long discussions and consultations, came up with 8 articles that they believed should be agreed to by all the signatories of the 1858 Treaty of Tianjin. That was the ask, and it was up to Anson Burlingame to sell this to the representatives of all the leaders who they intended to meet. They sailed to America first. As far as making time for the delegation, Burlingame had written to Seward, quote, "I may be permitted to add that when the oldest nation in the world, containing 1/3 of the human race, seeks for the first time to come into relations with the West and requests that this youngest nation, through its representative, to act as the medium of such change, the mission is not one to be solicited or rejected." End quote. Among the more than 24 members of the delegation, accompanying Burlingame as deputy heads of the mission, were Zhi Gang, a secretary in the Zhongli Yamen, and Sun Jiagu, a senior clerk, also at the Yamen. It was a 30-day voyage across the Pacific. Anson Burlingame had a 24K reputation and was well-liked and admired by some important people. His reputation preceded him, and this would open all the necessary doors for this first ever Chinese mission to the West, or more accurately, further west than Zheng He journeyed back in the 15th century. They set themselves up at the former Brown's Hotel that had recently changed its name to the Metropolitan in 1856. This grand old D.C. hotel, well, it isn't there anymore and was torn down in 1935. It was located on the northwest corner of 6th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue. During their stay there, the management flew the imperial flag of the Qing dynasty with the 5-clawed dragon on the yellow background. It was quite a spectacle for the local D.C. crowd. When the delegation arrived, Secretary of State Seward was busy with Reconstruction matters, and Washington, D.C. was paralyzed due to the impeachment proceedings being carried out against President Andrew Johnson. The polarization of today's American politics isn't anything new or anything that hasn't been seen before. For this reason, matters regarding the proposed treaty were kept very low-key. Because of this and other matters being worked out in these post-U.S. Civil War years, it took longer than needed to finalize matters regarding a treaty. The main meat of what Burlingame was negotiating for on China's behalf was to be treated decently and with reciprocity in certain matters. He was also proposing a legal pathway for the immigration of Chinese, mostly in demand in the Western states as workers by agricultural and industrial enterprises. Basically, the Burlingame-Seward Treaty came in the form of 8 additional articles to the Treaty of Tianjin of June 18, 1858. It was drafted by Secretary of State Seward and presented to Burlingame for final approval. After working on all the details of the proposed 8 additions to the Treaty of Tianjin, Seward arranged a meeting with the president. It was highly irregular that the Emperor of China himself didn't lead the mission. Seward explained clearly why, in this case, that wasn't possible. They were given a reply by the president's office saying, quote, "It is well understood by this government that, owing to the minority of the Emperor of China, the sovereign authority of the empire is now exercised by a regency. Reserving, therefore, and waiving, though only during the emperor's minority, the question concerning the privileges of a personal audience by the head of the Chinese government, the President of the United States will cheerfully receive their excellencies, the High Ministers of China, on Friday, June 14, 1868, at 12 o'clock at noon, at the Executive Mansion." End quote. The meeting went off okay, and the treaty was signed on July 28, 1868. The 8 additional articles to the Tianjin Treaty were China's right to dominion over her own territories and her jurisdiction over persons and property in the treaty ports, except as relinquished by treaty. It also returned control to China over inland trade and navigation, the reciprocal right to appoint consuls to American ports, and it ensured freedom from persecution for foreign religions in either country. And the big one was Article 5, which allowed for unrestricted voluntary migration between China and the United States and outlawed the coolie trade as it had come to be. Article 6 allowed reciprocal rights of travel and residence, but forbid naturalization by either party. Article 7 opened the doors to schools in each country to children of the other, meaning American schools and universities were open to Chinese students. And the final Article 8, it acknowledged the right of the emperor to make internal improvements unobstructed by foreign dictation or intervention, as well as his right to introduce such improvements when and as he pleased. With Article 5 of the Burlingame Treaty, Chinese immigration would no longer be this informal process that involved all kinds of abuse by racist and anti-immigrant elements in society. Prior to the Burlingame Treaty, Chinese nationals residing, working, or traveling in the U.S. didn't have the protection of a treaty signed by their government and the U.S. government. If anything happened, whether of their making or not, they were on their own. And we have plenty of recorded history attesting to how that all went for Chinese immigrants. Post-Burlingame Treaty Chinese in the United States had certain protections they didn't have before. The treaty very much encouraged the migration of Chinese citizens to the United States for work or to engage in business or for education. Chinese nationals living in the U.S. could emigrate and move freely within the U.S. And because China was granted most favored nation status, they too had the same privileges, immunities, and exemptions offered to other citizens of other countries who enjoyed MFN status with the U.S. However, as we know from history, it was easier to change laws than people's attitudes. Burlingame gave his ideas about the treaty in a speech where he said, quote, "There is another article which is also important to China. It has been the habit of foreigners in China to lecture the Chinese and to say what they should do and what they should not do. In fact, to prefer almost a demand and say when they should build railroads, when they should build telegraphs, and in fact, there has been an attempt to take entire possession of their affairs. This treaty denounces all such pretensions. It says particularly that it is for the Chinese themselves to determine when they will institute reforms, that they are the masters of their own affairs, and that it is for them to make commercial regulations and do whatever they will, which is not in violation of the law of nations, within their own territory. I am glad that it is in the treaty, and while the treaty expresses the opinion of the United States in favor of giving to China the control of her own affairs, it assumes that China is to progress, and it offers to her all the resources of American science and asks other nations to do the same. The United States have asked nothing for themselves, and I'm proud of it. I'm proud that this country has made a treaty which is, every line of it, in the present interests of China, though in the resulting interests of all mankind." End quote. They had just enjoyed a great triumph with the signing of this instrument that committed the United States to non-interference in China's internal affairs. It had also accorded China the same pair status and obligations that Americans shared with the Western powers. Unfortunately for Burlingame, in Europe, he didn't get the same results. Though he and the delegation he led were treated well, behind the scenes there was plenty of grumbling and in some cases downright animosity. After the signing of this momentous treaty in the United States, the first of its kind to treat China as an equal sovereign nation, the mission moved on to Europe, to London first. The optics of having an American former diplomatic and government official leading this mission didn't look good to some. They didn't like the whole idea of the USA acting in the role that had traditionally been the right of the Europeans going back to the 1600s. There was a sense of, what right does this barely 100-year-old country have to carry this torch around to the great capitals of Europe? By now, there was plenty of harumphing going on at the gentlemen's clubs and societies in London. There was this feeling among some that the success of this U.S.-led effort was won at their expense. They had been the ones to do all the heavy lifting in China and who were willing to be the bad guys for the sake of everyone else's profits. And the Yanks sort of came in after all the hard-won gains had been made. Well, why beat around the bush? There were those in power in both commerce and government who secretly believed if Burlingame forced the treaty powers to respect China and formally adopt the terms of the 8 additional articles enumerated, well, that took away the one and only one thing that allowed them to keep China in its place, a show of force. The champions of that line of thinking, the British East India Company, would be dissolved in 1874, but in 1868, thoughts of playing fair with China was still viewed as bad for long-term business prospects. Back then, there was still this unwillingness by many to look at China in the 1860s and 70s as an equal. It wasn't something that was broadly looked upon as a good thing. And to go and put all these altruistic ideals in a treaty that was championed by a Yank, it really didn't sit well with many who were a bit unwilling to give up their primacy in Asia. To quote one voice in Britain that represented the feelings of those with commercial interests in China, quote, "We rise from the perusal of this treaty with the conviction that there is more under it than appears on the surface. It bears distinct trace of foreign inspiration, and it is our belief that this inspiration did not originate with the Chinese government at all. That the idea of enlisting Mr. Burlingame as a temporary recruit for furthering Chinese ends, so far from being spontaneous, emanated from a foreign brain, and was suggested by the departure of the American envoy, then on the eve of quitting Peking. The plan was no doubt cordially welcomed by the Chinese ministers who, having but one object at heart, gave but one instruction: stop all progress. As to the rest, carte blanche, say and do what you like. The treaty concocted by the mission on its passage from China is the result before us." End quote. The Chinese mission wasn't snubbed, but they were kept waiting for about a month before they had their brush with greatness on November 20th, 1868, at Windsor Castle, meeting with Queen Victoria. Next up was the court of Napoleon III in Paris. January 21st, 1869, the members of the mission had their great moment in the Tuileries. They spent a very enjoyable 6 months in La Plus Belle Ville du Monde. Their period in the French capital was filled with gala events and plenty of fine discussion and probably good wine. There was a lot of head nodding, but like it had been in London, when it was all over, no treaty. By now, American Civil War hero Ulysses Grant was serving as the 18th president. He's better known across the world as the guy on the $50 bill. On November 24th, 1869, while the delegation was still in Europe, Emperor Tongzhi ratified these 8 additional articles contained in the Burlingame-Seward Treaty. And from Paris, they moved on to Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands. The diplomats from all 3 nations were amenable to these ideas of friendly and cooperative relations with China, but no one was willing to go as far as inking their names to any treaties. Things were fine the way they were. In January 1870, they received word that Russian Tsar Alexander II would be willing to meet with the members of the mission in St. Petersburg. And it was there that they met the Tsar Liberator, the man who had abolished serfdom in Russia in 1861 and who tried to bring reforms to the country. Now, I can't say I've ever been to Russia, but I hear from reliable sources that it gets pretty cold there in January. By the time Burlingame's delegation pulled into St. Petersburg, he was already ailing from a cold that he couldn't shake, and he developed a case of pneumonia. And to everyone's shock, Anson Burlingame died on the morning of February 23rd, 1870. Well, the show had to go on. Zhigang took over as the head of the mission, and they finished things off in Belgium and Italy before sailing back to China via the newly opened Suez Canal in October 1870. It was quite a tragedy that Burlingame should die so young and at such a time. When he died, the spirit of the Burlingame-Seward Treaty died along with him. Big business and big ag might have been thrilled to have all this lower-cost labor available thanks to Article 5 of the treaty, but others weren't so welcoming. By 1877, Dennis Kearney and all the supporters of his Working Man's Party of California, not to mention a great number of like-minded people, were chanting, "The Chinese must go." The Burlingame Treaty was signed July 28, 1868. 14 years later, the Chinese Exclusion Act was signed, and Burlingame's achievement was undone. Already by 1876, the winds had gone out of the sails of this treaty as age-old prejudices and politics that fed off these prejudices began to dilute the spirit of Article 5 of the treaty. The Chinese weren't so welcome anymore, if they had ever been, that is. This brief period of progressive diplomatic relations became more of an ideal to aspire to than something that people adhered to. First came the Angel Treaty of 1880, which modified the Burlingame Treaty and accelerated the backpedaling on Chinese labor immigration and putting limits on that whole thing. And when Chester A. Arthur signed the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, that took the Burlingame Treaty and buried it 6 feet under. And as far as welcoming Chinese students, that too fell out of favor and wouldn't be until the Boxer Indemnity Scholarships are established in 1909 that this brilliant idea was revived. There wasn't any social media back then like today, but misinformation and ways to rile people up and make them angry were available and put to nefarious use. One of America's greatest men of letters, Samuel Clemens, better remembered as Mark Twain, was very good friends with Anson Burlingame and knew him well. In 1906, more than 3.5 decades since Burlingame's death in St. Petersburg, had said of his friend, quote, "His outlook upon the world and its affairs was as wide as the horizon, and his speech was of a dignity and eloquence proper to it. He dealt in no commonplaces, for he had not commonplace thoughts. He was a kindly man and most lovable. He was not a petty politician, but a great and magnanimous statesman. He did not serve his country alone, but China as well. He held the balances even. He wrought for justice and humanity. All his ways were clean. All his motives were high and fine." End quote. Mark Twain had further lionized Burlingame when he said, quote, "He had outgrown the narrow citizenship of a state and become a citizen of the world, and his charity was large enough and his great heart warm enough to feel for all its races and labor for them. his fervent abolitionism, manifested in a time when it was neither very credible nor very safe to hold such a creed, had been the initial public demonstration of Burlingame's noble kindliness that could not comprehend narrowness or meanness. End quote. At his funeral, someone who, well, probably meant well, but had inappropriately said of Burlingame, quote, "He loved China as fondly as though the blood of Mongolians ran through his veins." End quote. Some historians and history-minded people look back on Anson Burlingame as someone at the vanguard of treating China as a sovereign equal rather than a backward, rebellion-infested nation ripe for commercial exploitation. In fact, he was a pioneer in many ways of the ideal of mutual respect in relations between countries. In American history, Burlingame is mostly remembered for the 1868 treaty that bears his name. For us in our day, it would be damn near impossible for anyone to do what Anson Burlingame did in 1867, 1868, being an American who carried out diplomacy on behalf of China. Someone would have to launch a whole new social media platform just to deal with all the netizens looking to vent about that. Yeah. Couldn't get away with such a thing now. He'd be branded an ultra shill and go down hard. Nonetheless, it wouldn't be the worst thing if someone, somewhere in this world, would be willing to step up and talk some sense into all concerned parties. Well, this Burlingame Treaty and the mission he led was an interesting moment from the history of China's foreign relations with the U.S., coming at a very exhausting decade on both countries' historical timeline. And I know there are many CHP listeners who, beyond the matter of preserving everyday low prices at their favorite stores, truly hope in their heart of hearts that the U.S. and China, despite all that we know and all the hurt feelings and anxieties, that we'll get some sort of a second Nixon moment like we did back in 1972. You know, you may say I'm a dreamer, but hey, I'm not the only one. Okay, that's all I got for you this time. This episode is slated for publication on May 28th, 2025. Of course, Patreon and CHP Premium subscribers heard this one long before that. You're all welcome to join me and other party elites, celebrities, and good old everyday working people in becoming a supporter of this long-running family program, still going strong since June of 2010. Okay, thanks for listening, everyone. This is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles, California. Do consider coming back again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.